Toledo, 1811. The air was heavy with the scent of wax and ash, and the wind carried the distant echo of cannon fire rolling across the Castilian plains. Within the convent of Santa Veronica, a single mirror hung upon the eastern wall, its surface rippling with candlelight, its silver backing breathing with the cold of dawn. When it fell, it did not simply break, it exhaled. A soft breath of centuries, of prayers and secrets, escaped through its fracture. Sister Clara was the first to hear it, the thin, aching sound of glass yielding to gravity, to history. She froze, her hands still powdered with fine sand from the glass workshop. Beatrice, the abbess, turned her head just in time to see the reflection split her face in two, half shadow, half flame. "It is only the mirror," Clara whispered, but Beatrice shook her head. "No, child, it is never only the mirror." Outside the city walls, Napoleon's army was drawing near the light of their torches, forming a serpent of gold and blood down the hill. The mirror had fallen at the precise hour the first cannonball struck the monastery's outer wall. Some said it was coincidence. Others whispered it was prophecy. When reflection breaks, faith fractures with it. And so began the slow shattering of the convent's soul. "Empires fear mirrors," the narrator murmured, "because mirrors never lie." Beneath the rubble of history, the broken surface still shimmered faintly, as though it could remember everything that once passed before it, the faces, the hymns, the doubt. And in that remembrance, the war had already begun, not the war of nations, but the war of memory itself. In the convent stillness, after the crash had settled into silence, the broken mirror lay upon the floor like a map of heaven torn apart. Sister Clara knelt beside it, afraid to touch the shards, for she had been taught since childhood that mirrors were not merely glass, they were vessels of reflection, fragments of the divine image. The abbess Beatrice stood behind her, the candlelight trembling in her hand. "Do you know," she said softly, "why mirrors are forbidden in times of war?" Clara shook her head. Beatrice's voice lowered, solemn as a confession. "Because when men lose their souls, glass remembers what they looked like before." The words lingered in the cold air, echoing faintly through the chapel like the dying note of a hymn. In the theology of their order, the mirror was not vanity, but a covenant, a way for creation to behold its creator, to remember form before corruption. When the mirror cracked, Beatrice felt a strange unease crawl beneath her ribs, as if the convent itself had blinked. "We see the world through reflection," she thought, "but who sees us?" In the scriptorium that night, Beatrice wrote by lamplight, "A mirror is the soul's witness when it shatters. So does memory. The reflection breaks first in silence, then in faith." Her ink trembled with the rhythm of distant artillery. Meanwhile, Sister Lucia, the blind one, stirred in her cell. Though her eyes were milk white, she could sense the tremor of the mirror's death. "Something has gone dark," she whispered. "No," Clara said. "It has gone bright in all the wrong places." Outside, the sky above Toledo burned like molten glass. The convent walls glowed faintly, catching light from both heaven and fire. "Empires fear mirrors," the narrator murmured again, "because they reveal the soul's cracks long before the body breaks." The city of Toledo had always been a mirror itself, a reflection of empires, faiths, and ruin. Its towers bore the scars of Rome, its cathedrals sang in Latin and in Greek, and its stones had known the touch of Moorish hands. By 1811, it stood like an old saint bleeding beneath new flags. The French banners hung limp in the winter air, stitched with the emblem of a revolution that had long devoured its own children. Soldiers marched through the cobblestone streets, their boots striking sparks like small heresies against the stones. The war had come not as thunder, but as a whisper first, through the decree that all monastic orders must surrender their archives for the preservation of civilization, then through the silent confiscation of relics, chalices, and mirrors. By the time the cannon fire reached the walls of Santa Veronica, the war was no longer about land, it was about memory. Abbess Beatrice had watched from the cloister's upper balcony, as the valley filled with smoke. Her rosary, a simple chain of blackened glass beads, clicked softly in her hand. She could hear the city's heartbeat in the distance, the low toll of bells, the shriek of horses, the desperate laughter of men too young to understand the meaning of empire. Every age invents its own apocalypse, she thought. Ours merely learned how to march. Sister Clara worked feverishly in the workshop, repairing fragments of stained glass torn from the chapel's windows by artillery shock. Her fingers bled freely, though she barely noticed. "We can still rebuild the rose window," she murmured, "if the pieces remember each other." Lucia sat nearby, her blind eyes half open, her head tilted as though listening to something deeper than the noise of war. "It's not the glass that remembers," she said quietly. "It's the light." Outside, the French army established its camp beside the Tagus River. Captain Montreuil, a man of sharp uniform and dull conscience, stood before a map dotted with crimson wax. "Toledo will not burn," he said to his officers. "It will reflect." The men laughed. He meant the city would serve as an example, a mirror of French order imposed upon Spanish chaos. Yet Beatrice heard those words later, carried by rumour, and they chilled her. She understood what it meant when conquerors spoke of reflection. It was the erasure of the original image. Within the convent walls, the sisters prayed as if their voices could outsing cannon fire. The hymns trembled, uneven, their Latin phrases breaking like thin ice. Beatrice felt the floor shake beneath her feet and imagined it was the pulse of the earth itself, an old heart, refusing to surrender its rhythm to war. "Do you fear them?" Clara asked her one evening, as the two of them carried water from the courtyard well. Beatrice's eyes lifted toward the distant horizon where musket smoke glowed like dawn. "No," she answered. "I fear what we will become once we learn to survive them." At night, she would walk through the chapel and see reflections trembling upon the shards of the fallen mirror. The light moved across them like a restless spirit, reforming the broken faces of the sisters in strange geometries, eyes and lips and halos flickering in impossible alignment. It was as though the mirror were trying to remember itself. Empires erase by forcing reflection, Beatrice thought, but the soul resists by remembering. The war outside thickened. Toledo became a theatre of contradictions. Churches turned to hospitals, priests to smugglers, soldiers to confessors. Rumours spread that the French had discovered ways to use mirrors for mapping, placing them on rooftops to signal artillery. Each reflection, then, became both sacred and strategic. The sisters began to cover their mirrors with cloth, fearing the glint of sunlight might summon death. Yet Beatrice refused to hide the great mirror beneath the altar, the last whole one. "If God gave it the power to reflect," she said, "then he gave it the power to defy." Lucia would often sit before it, though she could not see. "Tell me what it shows today," she would ask. Clara would describe the smoke crawling across the valley, the flames licking the sky, the faint image of their own faces flickering between the shadows. "Then it still remembers," Lucia whispered. "And as long as it remembers, we are not gone." The convent became an island of fragile faith amid the flood of empire. The soldiers outside shouted in French, the sisters inside whispered in Latin. Between those languages hung the ghost of something older, the silence of reflection, where truth could neither be burned nor commanded. And above them all, the shattered mirror waited in its quiet, silver ruin, gathering light from the fires of Toledo, as though preparing to speak. "Empires fear mirrors," the voice returned again, softer now, like a sigh beneath the rubble. "Because, in their reflection, they see what cannot be conquered, the memory of what was whole." They were not sisters by blood, but by vow, three reflections of one faith, each carrying a different wound. Abbess Beatrice, born to an old Castilian family, had once studied theology under Jesuits before retreating into the convent to escape the politics of men. Her eyes were dark and unyielding, carved by years of prayer and disappointment. To her, the convent was not sanctuary, but penance, a place where silence could be made to confess. Sister Clara, the youngest, had arrived as an apprentice glassmaker from Valencia, a child of the artisan class whose hands spoke the language of light. She understood how to bend sand into colour, how to trap sunlight within windows until it became holy. Lucia, the third, had been born blind in Madrid. The church had nearly refused her entry, fearing she could not serve in the choir or the infirmary. But Beatriz had insisted. "She sees what we refuse to," she said. "Let her stay." And so Lucia became the listener, the mirror of sound and silence within their walls. When the war came to Toledo, each woman met it differently. Beatriz faced it as judgment, a test of whether faith could exist without certainty. Clara saw it as desecration, a hand reaching into her craft and breaking the fragile order of glass. Lucia felt it as vibration, as the change in air that precedes ruin. Together they formed an unlikely trinity: the thinker, the maker, and the witness. Every morning they gathered in the chapel where the great mirror rested behind the altar, veiled by a thin white cloth. Beatriz prayed aloud, her voice slow and deliberate, as if translating grief into syllables. Clara polished the silver edges with care, whispering under her breath, "You will not forget us." Lucia sat cross-legged on the cold floor, her face tilted toward the light filtering through the broken rose window. "It hums," she said once, her tone both frightened and serene. "The mirror hums when the world outside screams." Beatriz placed a hand on her shoulder. That is memory singing back to itself. At night, when the candles burned low and the city's fires glowed through the windows, Clara would tell Lucia what she could not see: the shadows of soldiers moving like spectres, the flicker of torches, the pale faces of statues melting in heat. "They think we are hidden," Clara said one evening. "But mirrors cannot hide, they only wait." Lucia smiled faintly. "Then perhaps we should listen to the waiting." The sisters began to notice changes in the mirror. Sometimes, when Clara wiped away dust, she would see shapes that were not theirs, faint outlines of men in uniform, their faces distorted, eyes hollow. "Reflections do not lie," Beatriz murmured. "The war has entered us." One evening, as the distant bombardment rattled the walls, Lucia rose suddenly and spoke. "There are 17 of us. I can feel them breathing, but I can only count 16 voices." Beatriz froze. "Who is missing?" she asked. "No one," Lucia said softly. "The mirror is breathing too." It became their habit, then, to speak to the mirror before sleep. Not prayers exactly, but whispers of remembrance names, fragments of songs, confessions, half-spoken. The glass, fractured though it was, seemed to listen. Clara believed that each whisper etched itself into the silver backing, a hidden scripture written in heat and breath. Beatriz did not deny it. If the word was made flesh, she thought, perhaps reflection was made memory. As weeks passed, their bond deepened under siege. The convent became a small republic of faith and defiance. Beatriz led, Clara created, Lucia listened. 3 women surrounded by silence, each reflecting the other's fragment of divinity. They were the last clear surface left in a world turning opaque, and somewhere beneath their prayers, the mirror waited not as an object, but as an eye. "Empires fear mirrors," the inner voice whispered again, now unmistakably feminine, like a memory finding its tongue. Because in reflection, even the conquered remain infinite. By the early spring of 1811, Toledo was officially pacified. The word, printed on the orders of General Montreux, meant only that the screams had grown quieter. The French had learned long ago that to conquer a people, one must not only occupy their land, but also their reflection, the image by which they knew themselves. And so began what the soldiers called la règle du verre, the rule of glass. Under it, all mirrors, stained glass, and reflective relics were to be removed from churches and convents for the purpose of reconstruction and enlightenment. It was a polite way to say erasure. The order came to Santa Veronica on a pale morning, when frost clung to the garden statues like mourning veils. A young lieutenant named René Dufour arrived with 2 soldiers and a wax-sealed decree. He spoke in measured Spanish, his tone rehearsed. By order of His Imperial Majesty, Napoleon Bonaparte, the convent of Santa Veronica shall be transformed into a field hospital for the wounded of the campaign. All mirrors and reflective materials are to be collected for safe transport. Beatrice read the letter twice, each time slower than before. Her lips barely moved, but her eyes darkened like the storm behind stained glass. "And if we refuse?" she asked. The lieutenant hesitated. "Then the building will be repurposed without your consent, Madame Abbess. It is not a threat, it is progress. Progress." The word echoed through the chapel like blasphemy. Empires never destroy, they redefine, Beatrice thought bitterly. Clara stood beside her, trembling. "They will take the mirrors," she whispered. Beatrice answered, "Then we will teach the glass to remember without being seen." That night, the sisters gathered in secret. The air was sharp with the scent of cold stone and melted wax. 17 of them knelt around the great altar where the mirror lay, hidden beneath its veil. Beatrice spoke not as abbess, but as conspirator. "They will come for the mirrors," she said, "but not for the truth inside them. The great one we will hide, the smaller ones let them take them. Each piece they steal will carry a false reflection, and that is the only weapon we have left." Clara, her hands trembling, whispered, "How do we deceive reflection?" Beatrice turned toward her, the candlelight cutting her face into light and dark. "By showing them what they wish to see." She explained her plan, a method of replacing the silver backing on certain mirrors with a thin layer of smoked glass that, under bright light, reflected faintly, but under torchlight, appeared opaque. To the soldiers, they would seem broken or dull, useless for any mapping or surveillance. "And the rest?" Lucia asked quietly. "The great mirror?" Beatrice walked to the altar, drew back the veil, and stared at its gleaming surface. For a long moment, the sisters saw their reflections tired, pale, but still whole. Then Beatrice touched the frame with her palm and whispered, "We hide you not from sight, but from those who have forgotten how to see." Together, they lifted the mirror from the wall, careful not to breathe too hard, as though the glass itself could feel fear. They carried it through the crypt passage and slid it beneath the stone table of the altar, sealing it with wax and prayer. When the soldiers returned days later to convert the convent, they found the sisters compliant. The chapel's mirrors had been removed, their fragments stacked neatly in crates. Lieutenant Dufour wrote in his log, "The sisters are obedient, though melancholy. They possess unusual skill with glass. One of them, the young artisan, aided our men in dismantling the windows." The abbess appears resigned. Nothing of value was hidden, but history, like reflection, deceives those who trust the surface. Beneath the altar, the great mirror-weighted face turned downward, listening. The convent above became what the French called l'hôpital des reflets, the hospital of reflections. Soldiers and priests alike laughed at the irony. Wounded men would soon fill the pews, their bandaged faces mirrored by broken glass. Yet Beatrice knew what they could not. When a mirror is forced to reflect suffering, it becomes memory incarnate, and memory is rebellion. That evening, when the last soldier left the chapel, Lucia spoke from her corner, her voice trembling like light over water. "They think we have surrendered," she said. Beatrice answered, "Then let them keep thinking. A reflection that hides is still reflection." Outside, the bells of Toledo rang not for mass but for occupation. Inside, beneath the altar, the great mirror breathed in silence, its silver lungs filling with the war's first reflection. "Empires fear mirrors," the voice murmured once more, distant yet alive, "because glass remembers even when it is buried." Beneath the altar of Santa Veronica, silence became a living thing. The mirror lay in darkness, its surface hidden from light for the first time in a century. Yet those who walked above it felt something breathing through the stone, a cool pulse that made the air shimmer faintly, like heat mirage in winter. To the sisters, it was both comfort and terror. "It's sleeping," Clara whispered. Beatrice shook her head. "No, it's remembering." In the weeks that followed, the convent transformed into a field hospital. The French set up cots between pews, hung their banners across the nave, and filled the air with the smell of wine and disinfectant. The hymns of the sisters were replaced by groans, prayers in foreign tongues, and the dull rhythm of boots on sacred floor. Each corner of the chapel reflected pain, and yet, somewhere underfoot, a great silence gathered strength, a reflection untamed by empire. Sister Clara was forced to work alongside the occupying soldiers. Her skill with glass made her useful. She repaired shattered windows, fitted lamps, polished surgical mirrors. Each task felt like betrayal. Every reflection she touched belonged now to the enemy. Still, she obeyed, because Beatrice had instructed her, better to shape the light than let it be used against us. She used scraps of holy glass to craft small, imperfect mirrors, ones that warped faces just slightly, making each soldier appear older, more haunted, less human. The men laughed nervously at their own images, calling them unlucky glass. Clara said nothing. She only watched as they turned away from their distorted reflections. The mirror does not lie, she thought. It simply refuses to flatter. Lucia, the blind one, became the keeper of whispers. From her cell she could hear everything, the footsteps of soldiers pacing above, the clatter of metal trays, the half-stifled sobs of dying men. Yet beneath those sounds, she heard something else, a slow, rhythmic vibration that pulsed from the altar stones. "It speaks," she told Beatrice one night. "Not in words, but in light I cannot see." Beatrice touched her hand. "That is not speech," she said. "It is memory finding its voice." Every midnight, when the soldiers slept, the sisters gathered in the chapel. They prayed not aloud, but in thought, silent dialogues directed toward the buried mirror. Their thoughts were not of victory, but of endurance. Clara imagined the mirror's surface like skin, absorbing each word through the stone. Lucia described the vibrations as harmonies, like the heartbeat of glass. Beatrice, however, said nothing. Her faith had grown quieter, less certain. What if God has left the reflection? She wondered. What if memory is all we have left of him? The longer the mirror remained hidden, the more the convent changed. The soldiers began to complain of strange reflections, glimpses of faces that vanished when they turned. One man swore he saw a woman's figure in the water basin where he washed his hands. Another claimed his own reflection blinked before he did. They started avoiding mirrors altogether, even the polished metal of their muskets. Captain Montreuil called it superstition. "War makes men see ghosts," he said. Beatrice heard him and thought, war only uncovers the ghosts we brought with us. One evening, Clara returned from the infirmary with trembling hands. "I saw it," she whispered to Beatrice. "The mirror in the operating tent. It showed not the man on the table, but the boy he once was, smiling, whole." Beatrice closed her eyes. Then the mirrors have begun to remember what we have forgotten. Outside, spring thawed the blood-stained fields. The Tagus River swelled, carrying reflections of clouds and fire downstream. From the cloister window, Lucia faced the unseen horizon. "They will search again," she said. "They will dig until they find what we've hidden." Beatrice looked toward the altar. "Then we will let them find it, but not as it was." For beneath that altar, the mirror had begun to breathe faster. The silver pulse grew warmer each night, and in its depth, though unseen shapes stirred. Faces, light, memory. The war had entered it completely, and something ancient within the glass was beginning to wake. Empires fear mirrors. The whisper rose from below, softer than prayer, stronger than steel. Because even when buried, reflection endures, and endurance is the slowest form of rebellion. At first, the sound was faint, like a soft sigh woven through the hum of prayers. Sister Lucia heard it before anyone else. To her, the world had always been made of echoes. Footsteps through the cloister, water dripping from the roof, the slow turn of key and candle. But this was different. It was as if the stone itself was whispering back. "It speaks when no one prays," she told Beatrice one night, like the echo of something older than our words. Beatrice did not answer at once. She had grown thinner in those weeks, her face hollowed by hunger and thought. Since the convent's conversion into a hospital, she had spent her days tending to dying soldiers and her nights writing reports to the French command, empty words of obedience, masking quiet rebellion. But the whispers disturbed her. They came when the chapel was empty, when even the wounded slept. Sometimes she would stand above the altar and feel a vibration beneath her feet, as though the heart of the earth were beating beneath the stones. Sister Clara, curious and terrified, began to listen too. One night, she placed her ear against the altar and gasped. It was not one voice she heard, but many hundreds, layered like reflections upon reflections. They spoke not in a single language, but in fragments of Latin, French, Castilian, and something else, a wordless current of breath and sorrow. "They are remembering," she whispered. "The mirror remembers every face it ever saw." Beatrice knelt beside her. "Memory cannot speak," she said. "It only waits." But even as she said it, the stone beneath her hand trembled. She felt warmth radiate upward, faint, pulsing, alive. The next morning, one of the soldiers in the infirmary screamed. He claimed he had seen his own face floating in a bowl of blood, smiling at him. Others reported similar visions, reflections in water basins, in lamp glass, in polished metal, all slightly wrong, as if some unseen eye were peering back through them. Captain Montreal ordered every reflective surface covered. "Superstitious fools," he said. But he himself began to shave in the dark. Beatrice gathered the sisters. "We have hidden something too powerful," she said. "The mirror does not sleep anymore." Lucia tilted her head, her unseeing eyes bright with inner light. "It never slept," she said. "It was listening to us. Now it repeats what we have become." That night, Beatrice dreamt of the mirror. In her dream, it lay beneath the altar, glowing from within, its surface rippling like liquid silver. Faces appeared in it, her own, Clara's, Lucia's, and hundreds more, overlapping and merging. When she reached toward it, her reflection did not follow. It stared back with someone else's eyes, eyes filled with light and fire. She awoke, drenched in sweat, the echo of a voice lingering in her skull. "Empires are built upon forgetting. We are built upon reflection." The next day, strange accidents began. A nurse slipped and cut her hand on a glass vial. When she looked down, her blood shimmered like mercury. A lantern fell and shattered, yet instead of flame, the shards reflected a moving light that crawled across the wall like water. Even the French chaplain assigned to the hospital began to mutter prayers against demonic radiance. Beatrice said nothing. She merely looked toward the altar and thought, "The divine does not punish, it remembers." That evening, as the sun died over the hills, the sisters gathered once more in silence. Lucia stood at the altar, her hands pressed against the stone. The vibration now was unmistakable, steady, rhythmic, alive. "It's breathing," she said. "No," Beatrice replied. "It's praying." From beneath the altar came a deep, slow hum. The sisters could feel it in their bones, like a choir of unseen voices rising from the foundation. It was neither beautiful nor terrifying, it was inevitable. Clara began to weep. "It knows," she said. "It knows everything we've hidden." Beatrice raised her eyes toward the crucifix, its wood darkened by smoke. "Then let it know," she said. "Let the mirror bear our memory when we are gone. That is its purpose." Outside, the wind swept through the cloisters, rattling the broken panes of stained glass. The light that entered was fragmented shards of red, blue, and gold, dancing upon the walls like fleeting souls. Lucia smiled faintly, though she could not see. "It's speaking to us," she whispered. Beatrice nodded slowly. "Then we must listen." Beneath their feet, the mirror pulsed once more, one long, resonant breath, and from the cracks of the altar, a thread of light escaped, thin as smoke, curling upward through the dark. "Empires fear mirrors," the whisper came again, closer this time, as if spoken from within the air itself, because when reflection begins to speak, silence becomes their judge. By late summer, the convent was a ruin of contradictions, half hospital, half tomb, all reflection. The French banners still hung in the nave, tattered by candle smoke, while beneath the altar, the great mirror pulsed like a buried heart. The sisters moved through the halls as ghosts among the living, tending to the wounded, whispering prayers that no longer sounded like devotion but like memory itself, refusing to die. The air was heavy with incense and rot, with hope stretched so thin it became almost transparent. Beatrice no longer knew what she believed. She had spent her life worshipping silence, the sacred absence of God as proof of his mystery. Yet now, silence spoke back, through light and vibration, through voices that rose from beneath the altar when the night deepened. If this is divinity, she thought, then it does not forgive, it remembers. Her doubts began quietly, like cracks forming beneath frost. One night, after hearing a dying soldier confess in French, a boy of 16, whose only sin was surviving too long, she knelt in the chapel and whispered, "If you are here, Lord, why do you remember everything but mercy?" The echo that came from beneath the floor was not divine. It was human, weary, and endless. Because mercy forgets, I do not. She froze. The air shimmered as though heat rose from invisible fire. Lucia stirred in her sleep in the next room, murmuring words that belonged to no prayer. Beatrice felt a chill crawl up her spine. Was it God, or the mirror, that answered me? She wondered. The next morning, she found Clara at the workshop, her hands streaked with soot and blood. "I broke it," Clara said, trembling. "The small mirror I used for the soldiers. It showed me my own face, but not as I am. Older, burned, dying." Beatrice steadied her. "The mirror only reflects what the soul believes," she said softly. "And what do you believe, Mother?" Clara asked. "That we are already dying," Beatrice replied. "Only the mirror refuses to accept it." She turned to the window. Outside, the fields shimmered in the heat, their reflections trembling on the river's surface. "Look," Clara said, "even the world wavers like glass now." Beatrice watched the horizon melt into the sky. "When memory burns," she murmured, "truth becomes light. That's when men call it madness." That evening, the French chaplain, Father Delaroche, came to her. He was young, too delicate for war, his collar stained with sweat. "Madame Abbess," he said carefully, "some of the men have begun seeing things. They speak of light under the altar. They say it calls their names." Beatrice met his gaze with calm defiance. "Perhaps it calls them to confession," the priest frowned. "Do not mock grace, Mother. Whatever is beneath this chapel, it is not holy." Beatrice smiled faintly. "And what is holiness, Father? That which obeys your empire." "Your emperor?" he flushed. "This is blasphemy." "No," she said. "This is remembrance. There is a difference." That night, she dreamed again. The mirror's surface opened like a door. From within poured light, not pure, but fractured, filled with the reflections of every sin she had ever confessed. She saw herself ordering silence from frightened novices, refusing to help beggars at the gate, blessing soldiers before they marched to die. The reflections multiplied, each more merciless than the last. She tried to close her eyes, but they would not obey. The mirror whispered, "You prayed for salvation, but salvation is only the forgetting of pain. I was made to remember." She awoke to the sound of Lucia humming. "The mirror is speaking again," Lucia said softly. "It asks who we are without our reflections." Beatrice's voice shook. "Then it asks what even God has not dared to." Days passed. The voices grew louder, and faith grew quieter. The sisters began to doubt their prayers. They could no longer tell whether their worship reached heaven or merely echoed off the buried glass below. Some nights, the light from beneath the altar leaked through the cracks, faintly illuminating their faces during Vespers. Clara said it was beautiful. Beatrice said it was a warning. Empires, fear mirrors, the whisper said that night as Beatrice knelt before the altar, her eyes full of tears, because mirrors force them to see not what they conquer, but what they have become. She pressed her forehead against the cold stone. "Then show me," she said aloud. "If faith remains, let it burn me clean." And beneath her, the mirror answered with a low hum, neither acceptance nor denial, only remembrance. Father de la Roche had come to Toledo, believing in the certainty of God. He had studied in Paris under the new rationalists who taught that faith and progress could walk hand in hand, that the Enlightenment had merely trimmed the excess from religion, not destroyed it. But when he entered the convent of Santa Veronica, that certainty began to rot like old fruit. The air inside felt alive, thick with something that watched. The soldiers joked that the walls breathed, but the priest felt it in his prayers, the strange pressure beneath the altar, the hum that would not cease, the light that flickered even when no candle burned. He had come to bless the wounded, yet each time he recited the Latin rites, his reflection in the basin beside the bed would mouth something different. Once, when he whispered, "Requiem aeternam dona eis, Domine," his reflection smiled and said, "Remembrance, not rest." He dropped the basin, shattering it, his heart pounding. The soldiers laughed, calling him le prêtre de verre, the glass priest. That night, he went to Beatrice. She was seated near the altar, her rosary glinting faintly in the lamplight. "Mother," he said, "I must know what lies beneath your chapel." Beatrice did not look up. "The truth," she said, "and truth does not sleep quietly. You have no right to keep such things," he said sharply. "The church forbids." "The church," she interrupted, "has forgotten what it means to see." He hesitated. "I am not your enemy." "No," she replied. "You are your own." Her calm frightened him more than any curse. He tried to pray, but the words felt like smoke in his mouth. "This place," he said finally, "is unclean." Beatrice turned her eyes toward him, eyes that seemed to see through him, not at him. Everything that remembers is unclean to those who wish to forget. That night, Delaroche dreamt of light. He was standing before a vast mirror that stretched across the horizon, its surface rippling with the faces of every man he had absolved. They begged him not for forgiveness, but for remembrance. "Tell God what we look like," they cried. He woke screaming. When he looked into the small mirror on his desk, his reflection blinked a moment too late. The following day, he performed Mass in the occupied chapel. His voice trembled. When he lifted the chalice, its polished rim flashed, and in that gleam, he saw not the blood of Christ, but the reflection of the great hidden mirror beneath the floor, glowing faintly through stone. He nearly dropped the cup. The soldiers knelt, unaware. Beatrice's eyes met his across the nave. For a moment, he understood. This was not blasphemy, but revelation, a truth too bright for doctrine to contain. After the service, he confronted her again. "Whatever lives beneath this place," he whispered, "is not of heaven, nor of hell," she said. "It is of us." He trembled. "You speak like a heretic." "And you," she said, "like a frightened man who has finally seen his soul." That night, Father Delaroche entered the chapel alone. He knelt before the altar, his hands shaking, his breath fogging in the cold. "If you are God," he whispered, "show me mercy. If you are not, show me truth." The answer came as a soft vibration beneath his knees, then a light, faint but alive, seeping through the cracks. He leaned closer. For an instant, he saw his reflection on the floor, eyes hollow, mouth open in prayer or scream, and then it shifted, showing him as he would die. Face down, hands clasped, swallowed by light. He fled, gasping. But in the silence that followed, the whisper lingered. Empires fear mirrors, Father, because when they pray, the glass prays back. The next morning, he left his cassock folded neatly on the chapel steps. His crucifix lay upon it, glinting like a shard of glass. No one saw him again. By autumn, the convent of Santa Veronica had become a theatre of suffering. The pews were gone, replaced by rows of cots. The holy water fonts had been scrubbed clean and filled with vinegar for sterilization. Candles burned day and night, their flames shivering in the damp air, casting thin veils of light upon the wounded, and everywhere, reflections. In every metal bowl, every shard of glass, every sheen of blood, something watched back. The soldiers thought the mirrors cursed. They began to cover them, but even then, the reflections persisted. A man could see his face in the shine of his boot or in the tears of another. At first it was mere superstition, then madness. One young corporal, delirious with fever, screamed that his reflection was whispering to him, telling him not to die, but to remember. He tore the sheet from the mirror and hurled it across the room, shouting in French, "It knows my name." He died before morning. Sister Clara was tending to him when it happened. His body was still warm when she looked down at the broken glass and saw not the dead soldier's face, but her own, pale and trembling. Yet behind her reflection, another image shimmered, a younger woman with the same eyes, working glass in sunlight. It was her, years ago, before vows and war. Is the mirror showing memory or mercy? She wondered. She touched the shard, and it burned her fingertip. Lucia, sensing her distress, entered quietly. "It has begun to show the living as they were," she said, though she could not see. "It no longer reflects flesh, only time." Clara wept. "Then it shows ghosts." Lucia smiled faintly. "Perhaps we are all ghosts already." Beatrice tried to maintain order, but the convent had become a mirror labyrinth. The French surgeon, a pragmatic man named Chasseloup, approached her in fear. "Your sisters are poisoning the men with superstition," he hissed. "They say their reflections call their names. This is madness." Beatrice met his eyes steadily. "Then why do you tremble when you pass the altar?" He glared at her but said nothing. Later that night, he slit open a lantern and stared into its glass, desperate to see truth. What he saw instead was himself older, grey, broken. A man not yet dead, but already reflected in memory. In the days that followed, the wounded began to die, not from infection, but from terror. They stopped speaking, as if afraid their own words might echo back. The chapel filled with strange light, not from the candles, but from beneath. Beatrice noticed it one evening as she knelt for prayer, a faint silver glow leaking from the cracks between tiles. "It's rising," Lucia whispered. "The mirror can't contain what it remembers." That night, the sisters gathered once more. They sat in a circle, listening to the groans of the dying. "The mirror shows them what they were," Clara said. "But what does it show us?" Beatrice answered, "What we have become." The hum beneath the floor grew louder, resonating through their bones. The candles flickered wildly, their flames bending toward the altar as though drawn by breath. Lucia lifted her face to the light. "It's not vengeance," she murmured. "It's mourning." Beatrice closed her eyes. The world itself is mourning through glass. Outside, thunder rolled. Inside, the reflections multiplied. Each shard of glass, each polished instrument, each tear became a fragment of the same infinite mirror. Faces appeared and vanished. The dying smiled as though greeted by someone unseen. The French soldiers began to cross themselves again, whispering prayers they had long forgotten. By dawn, the convent was silent. Dozens had perished overnight, their eyes open, pupils glazed with faint silver. When Clara washed their faces, she saw her own reflection in every drop of water, not as she was, but as if seen by something older, wiser, unafraid. Beatrice stood before the altar, feeling the pulse beneath her feet. The mirror's voice was no longer distant. It breathed with her. "Empires fear mirrors," it whispered, "tender and terrible, because reflection turns conquest into confession." By the final days of October, the air inside Santa Veronica had turned to glass. Sound moved differently. It echoed where it should have died, and died where it should have echoed. The soldiers no longer joked. They avoided mirrors, spoke in whispers, crossed themselves at the faintest shimmer of light. Beatrice could feel it, the tension of reflection, stretched thin as wire. The mirror beneath the altar had grown restless. Sometimes, when she stood above it, she could hear faint laughter, not mocking, not cruel, but the brittle laughter of memory refusing to stay buried. The French command grew suspicious. Too many reports of visions, too many men driven mad. Captain Montreuil himself returned, his eyes hollow from sleepless nights. He accused Beatrice of witchcraft. "You are harbouring something," he said, slamming his fist against the altar. "A weapon, a relic, a curse, whatever it is, I will find it." Beatrice stood calm, her hands folded, her gaze unwavering. "You cannot break what you do not understand." His face twisted with rage. "Then we will see." He ordered the altar unsealed. The soldiers hesitated, crossing themselves before prying loose the stones. Beneath the heavy slab, wax cracked and light spilled thin, silver trembling like breath. When they pulled the last stone free, the mirror was revealed. Its surface was perfect, unclouded by dust, as though it had been waiting for this moment. Montreuil stepped forward, sword drawn. "What is this?" he demanded. "A saint's relic?" Beatrice whispered. "A reflection of what remains when empire ends." He raised his sword. "If it is holy, it will not break." She met his eyes. "If it breaks, you will see yourself." He struck. The blade met glass with a sound like thunder, not shattering, but singing. The light burst outward, flooding the chapel in white fire. Every surface, windows, metal, water flared alive, reflecting 1,000 faces. Soldiers, sisters, ghosts, and strangers. Montreuil staggered back, screaming. In the mirror, he saw not his own face, but a boy's, his brother, killed at Austerlitz, weeping silently. He dropped his sword. Mon Dieu. The soldiers panicked. Some fled, others fell to their knees. Clara shielded her eyes, though the light seemed to pierce through flesh, showing bones like glowing veins. Lucia, blind yet seeing, whispered, "It has woken." Beatrice stepped closer to the mirror. Her reflection rippled, younger, then older, then something neither alive nor dead. "You remember us," she said softly. "Now remember them." And the mirror obeyed. The light dimmed, coalescing into images, battlefields, cities burning, churches turned to dust. Voices filled the air, men crying for mothers, women calling to sons, the sound of prayers and screams woven into one unending lament. The soldiers fell silent, watching their empire replay itself in perfect reflection. There was no judgment, only truth, the kind that makes confession unnecessary. Montreuil dropped to his knees. "Make it stop," he pleaded. Beatrice shook her head. "It does not stop. It remembers." He turned his pistol toward her. "Then I will silence it." Beatrice did not flinch. "You cannot kill what has already seen you." He fired. The bullet struck the mirror's edge. For an instant, there was silence, then the glass cracked. Not shattered, but split into 17 perfect fragments, each glowing with its own light. The air hummed. The soldiers screamed as their reflections multiplied, chasing them through the fractured glass. Clara reached for Beatrice, but the abbess only smiled faintly. "It is done," she whispered. Lucia began to pray, her voice trembling with awe. "Nos recordamus per speculum," she murmured. "We remember through the mirror." The others joined her, their voices rising above the chaos. The chapel trembled. Light filled every corner, every breath. The sound of glass breaking became indistinguishable from the sound of wings. When it ended, the air fell still. The soldiers were gone. Some fled, some lay motionless. The mirror fragments floated briefly in the air, then descended slowly like snow, each landing with the softness of a sigh. Beatrice knelt, her face bathed in the last gleam of silver. "If this is sin," she whispered, "then let remembrance be my penance." "Empires fear mirrors," the voice said for the last time that night, "because when they break, they show the face of truth." When the light withdrew, it left silence behind a silence so dense that even the wind dared not pass through it. The convent stood half in ruin, half in radiance. The French banners had burned to ash. Their blackened poles jutted like bones through the air. The pews, the cots, the walls all coated in a fine silver dust that shimmered faintly under the dim morning light. It was as if the explosion of reflection had coated the world with memory. Beatrice rose slowly from the floor. The chapel smelled of smoke and metal, of candle wax and blood. The mirror fragments lay scattered around her feet, each still breathing with faint inner light. She reached down and picked one up. It was warm, pulsing softly like a heart. In its curved surface, she did not see her face, but thousands of others, the sisters, the soldiers, the dying, the forgotten. They all looked at her as though waiting. She whispered, "You are free now." Clara emerged from the haze, coughing, her veil torn. Her eyes were wide with both terror and awe. "Mother," she said. "It showed me my mother's face. She was smiling. She forgave me." Beatrice nodded. "It remembers what love once looked like." Lucia stumbled toward them, guided only by the echo of their breathing. Her hands reached out, finding a fragment on the ground. "It's still warm," she said softly, like sunlight caught in stone. Outside, the air glowed faintly. The river Tagus carried a film of silver light on its surface, flowing through Toledo like liquid memory. Those who survived said that for 3 nights after the breaking, the city had no shadows. Everything reflected everything. Even darkness gleamed. Captain Montreal's men had vanished. Some fled into the countryside. Some wandered the streets muttering prayers. Some took their own lives. It was said the captain himself walked into the river at dawn and disappeared, his reflection rippling once before, fading forever. The war did not end that day, but something in it broke, something that could not be rebuilt by empire or decree. Beatrice gathered the surviving sisters in the courtyard. They were 17 still, though not all the same who had knelt there before. Some were missing. Others, who had been presumed dead, returned, dazed, pale, whispering of a place made of light and glass. They spoke of seeing the convent whole again, untouched by war, suspended in reflection. Was it heaven? Clara asked. Lucia shook her head. No, it was what heaven remembers when men forget it exists. In the days that followed, they began to rebuild. They swept away ashes, gathered mirror shards, and placed them in a chest beneath the altar. Beatrice sealed it with wax and carved words into the stone. Nos recordamus per speculum. We remember through the mirror. At night, the sisters would still hear faint hums from beneath the chapel, though the great mirror was gone. It was as if its fragments had not died, only dispersed the light inside them now woven into the very air. Sometimes the walls would glow faintly, showing faces for an instant before fading. The sisters stopped being afraid. They had lived long enough to understand that remembrance was not a curse. Lucia, sitting by the window one evening, said softly, "I cannot see the light, but I feel it everywhere, in the breath, in the water, in the dust." Beatrice smiled gently. That is because the world itself has become a mirror. Weeks later, when French command returned to Toledo, they found the convent empty. The soldiers recorded it in their ledgers. Structure abandoned, no bodies. Signs of fire, no cause determined. They did not see the faint glimmer of light beneath the stones, nor the carvings hidden behind the altar. They did not feel the warmth in the walls. Empires do not feel, they only record. But the mirror had learned to remember without reflection. Its light moved through time, invisible but unforgotten. It lingered in the air like the last note of a hymn that refuses to end. And somewhere beyond the ruins, where the river met the plain, the sun struck the water and broke into 17 lines of silver, each one stretching toward the horizon like a path home. Empires fear mirrors, the voice said for the final time, gentle as a prayer, because light never dies, it only waits to be remembered. The city of Toledo spoke in whispers for years after the light. Old women told stories of the monjas de cristal, the sisters of glass, who had vanished into their own reflections. Children dared each other to approach the ruins of Santa Veronica at dusk, where, they said, voices still sang through the cracks in the stones. But the truth lived elsewhere, in the faint silver dust that clung to windows, in the rivers that shimmered too brightly under the sun, in the quiet hearts of those who remembered the war but could not name what had ended it. The 17 sisters had not died, or if they had, death itself had not noticed. Beatrice no longer counted days. She moved through the silent halls like a figure in a dream, her hands tracing the walls that hummed faintly with memory. Each stone seemed alive with reflection, each corridor holding a ghost of laughter, prayer, or grief. She began to realize that the convent had not been destroyed, it had been absorbed. The fragments of the mirror, sealed beneath the altar, had not remained still. At night, they shifted, glowed, called to each of the 17 by name. When the sisters gathered to pray, the light beneath their feet aligned with their voices. 17 pulses, 17 rhythms, one for each life that had chosen remembrance over survival. Clara called it the heart of glass. Lucia called it the pulse of God. Beatrice, ever cautious, said, "It is what remains when both faith and empire have finished speaking." One evening, when the moon hung low and red, the sisters stood barefoot in the chapel. The air shimmered with that familiar hum. As they began to chant their Vesper hymn, the floor beneath them rippled like water. Light rose through the cracks, silver and living, and one by one their reflections appeared not in mirrors, but upon the air itself. Each sister saw her other self standing before her, calm, luminous, eternal. "Is it death?" whispered Clara. "No," said Beatrice, her voice trembling. "It is memory taking form." Lucia stepped forward first, her blind eyes open and radiant. "I can see," she said softly, "but I do not see the world. I see its echo." The others reached out to their reflections. Their hands met light warm, pulsing, gentle. They understood then, the mirror had not broken them apart. It had multiplied their existence, turned their souls into living reflections, scattered through time like seeds of remembrance. From that night onward, the sisters began to fade, slowly, painlessly, like breath dissolving into dawn. Clara was the first to go. She smiled as her body turned translucent, the candlelight passing through her like stained glass. "I am not leaving," she whispered. "I am only becoming what I've made." One by one, the others followed, until only Beatrice and Lucia remained. Beatrice took Lucia's hand. "Are you afraid?" she asked. Lucia shook her head. "No. I have never seen so clearly." Beatrice smiled faintly. "Then go, child. The world will need eyes made of light." Lucia stepped forward and vanished into her reflection. Beatrice was alone. The chapel glowed with faint radiance. She knelt before the altar one last time and whispered, "We remember," through the mirror. Then she closed her eyes and let the light take her. When dawn came, the convent was empty again. But 17 faint silhouettes remained burned into the walls, not shadows, but luminous outlines, like figures made of dawn. They never faded. The villagers who later entered the ruins swore that when sunlight struck those outlines, the air filled with music, soft and endless, as if the light itself were singing. And so they were remembered, not as martyrs or saints, but as reflections that refused to vanish. 17 women, 17 fragments, 17 truths. Together, they became the mirror the world could not shatter. Empires fear mirrors. The echo lingered through the dust and morning light. Because reflections do not die, they simply wait for someone brave enough to see them. Nearly a century passed before anyone dared to dig beneath the stones of Santa Veronica again. Time had softened the scars of war, but not erased them. The convent, long abandoned, had collapsed into a garden of ruins, ivy crawling across broken walls, birds nesting in the hollow of the nave. The townspeople still avoided it, whispering that light behaved strangely there, that mirrors cracked without reason, that those who lingered too long could hear singing when the wind passed through. In 1904, an architect named Don Emilio Vargas arrived from Madrid to restore the old site. He was a rational man, a student of modernism and concrete, a believer in progress. "There are no ghosts," he told his workers, "only stories built from guilt." They nodded, but crossed themselves anyway. For 3 days, they cleared the debris, stacking stone and ash into tidy order. On the 4th day, beneath the cracked tiles of what had once been the chapel floor, a labourer's pick struck something that did not sound like stone. The noise rang high and pure, not dull like metal, but resonant, like the memory of a bell. "Señor, venga aquí," the man called. Vargas knelt, brushing away the dust. Beneath the rubble lay a smooth, pale surface. As he cleared it, his reflection swam into view, dim at first, then sharp, as though the mirror itself were waking from sleep. It was impossibly intact, unclouded by time. Vargas's heart pounded. "A miracle of preservation," he murmured. "Or chemistry." He ordered the men to lift it. The mirror was larger than expected, framed by traces of melted silver and ancient wax. Its weight felt alive. When sunlight struck it for the first time in nearly 100 years, the entire chamber seemed to inhale. One of the workers gasped, "Señor, it shines like blood." Vargas leaned closer. At the top of the frame, barely visible beneath the soot, was an inscription Latin, hand-carved. Nos recordamus per speculum. He whispered the translation, "We remember through the mirror." He frowned, intrigued. "Probably an old convent motto," he said aloud, though something in his voice trembled. He ordered the mirror moved to the courtyard for cleaning. As they lifted it upright, the sunlight caught its surface, and for a moment Vargas saw not his reflection, but a woman's face, pale, serene, eyes filled with light. She was not beautiful in any earthly sense, but radiant with calm defiance. Then the image flickered, replaced by another, a young girl shaping glass, a blind woman smiling, a line of sisters kneeling in prayer. The air hummed faintly, like the sound of distant singing. The workers dropped the mirror in fear. It struck the ground but did not shatter. Instead, a thin beam of light escaped from a hairline crack and spread across the courtyard wall. There, as if painted by invisible hands, appeared faint outlined 17 figures, luminous as dawn. Vargas fell to his knees. "Dios mío," he whispered. He ordered the mirror reburied that evening. "Seal it," he said quietly. "It belongs to them." The men obeyed. When they placed the final stone over it, the last ray of sunlight caught the Latin words once more, glowing faintly like breath on glass. That night, Vargas wrote in his journal, "The convent was not built to keep faith, it was built to remember it. The mirror is no artifact. It is an archive. And when I looked into it, I did not see history. I saw history looking back." He never returned to Santa Veronica. The ruins were left undisturbed, the mirror sleeping again beneath the altar. But from that day on, Toledo's light seemed changed clearer, quieter, as though carrying the memory of those who once refused to be forgotten. Empires fear mirrors, the echo whispered through time, because even centuries later, reflection waits patient, intact, remembering everything we chose to bury. By the middle of the 20th century, Santa Veronica had become less a place than a rumour. Scholars cited it in journals as a site of anomalous acoustics, while mystics described it as a wound in the mirror of time. Tourists who wandered too near claimed to feel warmth underfoot, as if the ground itself were breathing. A few returned with stories of music that had no source, of flickers of light shaped like human forms when the sun passed through broken windows. The city ignored them. Toledo had grown modern now, its glass cathedrals and tram lines reflecting a different kind of faith, progress. But light has patience. In 1957, during restoration work on the old quarter, a group of engineers tested seismic sensors near the convent's ruins. When they sent a low-frequency vibration through the ground, the instruments registered a pulse, rhythmic, steady, unmistakably organic. They dismissed it as resonance. Yet that night, the lead engineer, a woman named Inés Romero, returned alone. She had grown up in Toledo and remembered her grandmother's stories of the mirror nuns. She knelt among the weeds and laid her hand on the earth. The soil was cool, but beneath it pulsed warmth, faint but alive, like a heartbeat trapped in stone. She whispered without meaning to, "Nos recordamus per speculum." The ground responded, a tremor so slight she thought she'd imagined it. Then she saw it, a thin line of silver light running through the cracks in the chapel foundation. It moved like a living thread, tracing the contours of forgotten walls, illuminating inscriptions long buried by dust. Inés froze. The light wasn't reflected. It emanated, as if the mirror below had decided to breathe again. For weeks after, strange phenomena spread through the neighborhood. Mirrors fogged without heat. Windows sang when touched by sunlight. Old photographs developed faint, luminous outlines around faces. People began to dream of voices, whispering in forgotten languages. A historian claimed that, while passing the site at dawn, he heard a woman's voice say, "We remember you." He swore it came from the stones. News spread quickly. Journalists descended, calling it El Milagro del Espejo, the miracle of the mirror. Scientists brought instruments, priests brought relics. But the mirror would not be found. Every attempt to excavate failed, tools broke, cameras malfunctioned, light bent inexplicably. The air grew heavy with silence, the kind that feels like listening. Inés kept returning, drawn by something deeper than curiosity. She began to record what she called light pulses, intervals of faint silver flashes beneath the soil, that coincided with human voices, not loud enough to hear, but measurable as vibrations. The data made no sense. Yet when she aligned the recordings on a graph, the pattern resembled a heartbeat, 17 repeating beats, cycling every few minutes, 17. One evening, overwhelmed by awe and exhaustion, she sat among the ruins and whispered, "Who are you?" And then, faintly, from nowhere and everywhere, a voice answered. It was not sound, but memory speaking through her bones. We are reflection. We are what remains when truth refuses to die. She wept. The air shimmered, and for a moment she saw them, 17 figures standing in light, their faces serene, unbroken, eternal. At the center stood Beatrice, her gaze neither merciful nor stern, only certain. "You built your world on forgetting," the voice said. "We built ours on remembering." Then the vision faded. Inés never spoke of it publicly, but her notebooks would later be found filled with sketches of light patterns, transcribed Latin phrases, and one final line written in trembling ink. Empires fear mirrors, because mirrors remember after empires forget. Years passed. The world grew louder, faster, more reflective glass towers rose over ancient streets. But sometimes, at sunset, the buildings of Toledo still flickered with a strange silver hue, as if the light itself were remembering the convent beneath its feet. And those who listened closely swore they could hear, beneath the hum of the modern city, the faintest echo of singing 17 voices, patient as time, clear as light. Light, Beatrice once wrote in her final scripture, is not the opposite of darkness, but the memory of it. Centuries later, that line would be rediscovered, carved faintly into a stone fragment from Santa Veronica, its letters smooth as if written by water itself. Historians called it poetic. Theologians called it heretical. Yet it endures because truth, like light, resists confinement. To understand what happened in the convent is to understand light as more than illumination, Light is not what lets us see, it is what forces us to remember. Every ray carries the echo of its journey. Stars long dead, fires long extinguished, eyes that once opened and closed. Reflection, then, is the moral act of the universe, the moment when light looks back at itself and refuses to forget. The empire that raised Toledo no longer exists. Its symbols eroded, its language softened by time. But the light that touched its soldiers still travels, crossing the infinite distances between memory and matter. The mirror of Santa Veronica was never simply glass. It was a covenant between the seen and the unseen. When it shattered, it did not die. It multiplied, 17 fragments, 17 voices, 17 witnesses, scattered across time. They became the pulse of remembrance within the world's surface, the silent conscience of every reflection that followed. When modern physicists later discovered that light behaves both as particle and wave, they unknowingly echoed Beatrice's doctrine that what we see is not presence, but persistence, not what is, but what remains. The convent had already known this truth. Every prayer, every shard of glass, every vibration beneath the altar had been proof that nothing truly vanishes. Perhaps that is why mirrors unsettle us. They do not merely repeat, they record. Each reflection adds a layer, invisible but eternal, an archive of every glance and gesture. To see oneself is to awaken the chain of memory that binds the living to the dead. Empires burn books, bury cities, silence tongues, but they cannot silence light. For every flame they extinguish, reflection endures, carrying the image forward. In this way, the philosophy of the mirror became the philosophy of rebellion. To remember is to defy, to reflect is to survive. Lucia, the blind sister who once felt the hum of the mirror through her fingertips, had said it best. Light does not belong to those who can see. It belongs to those who have been seen. And centuries later, the world began to understand. Photographs, films, screens, each became a new mirror, each one haunted by the same hum. Modern humanity covered itself in reflections, unaware it was continuing the same ancient vow. Nos recordamus per speculum. Even now, every pane of glass, every camera lens, every window at sunset holds a trace of the convent's reflection, that faint, steady glow, reminding us that memory is not the past. It is the light that refuses to die. And if you listen carefully, when sunlight bends across an empty room, you may still hear it, a low, pulsing hum, soft as breath, vast as time, 17 voices whispering through the glow. Empires fear mirrors, the echo endures, because light remembers what darkness teaches us to forget. At dusk, Toledo becomes a city of mirrors. The river catches fire with sunlight, the windows of the old quarter flare like open eyes, and for a few brief minutes, everything, stone, air, flesh, turns to reflection. It was in that hour that the miracle returned for the last time. The sky dimmed, yet the ruins of Santa Veronica glowed with an interior light, the way an ember glows long after the flame is gone. A group of pilgrims had gathered there, drawn by the stories. They were scholars, artists, skeptics, and the curious. Among them was a young girl with a camera. She raised it toward the fractured dome of the chapel, hoping to capture what history had erased. When she looked through the lens, she saw nothing but ordinary dust. Yet as the sun slipped below the horizon, a single beam found its way through the broken roof and struck the sealed altar. The light did not stop there. It passed through the cracks in the stone, through the soil, through the buried fragments of the mirror, and then it rose. Slowly, it climbed the air, scattering into thin lines of silver that converged above the pilgrims' heads. They gasped, for the lines formed not random shapes, but a perfect cross, simple, luminous, alive. It hung suspended for a moment, trembling like breath, before stretching across the ruined chapel and painting the walls with the faint silhouettes of 17 figures. No one spoke. The hum that followed was too deep to be sound, too pure to be silence. It was the vibration of time folding upon itself, the echo of every prayer ever whispered here. Some fell to their knees. Others wept without knowing why. The girl with the camera took a single photograph, and when she developed it later, the image revealed no people at all, only light in the form of a cross, and within it, the suggestion of faces. Beatrice was not there, and yet she was. Her voice came through the wind, neither loud nor ghostly, but clear as reflection. What is saved is not stone, nor name, but the light that remembers them. The cross brightened, then began to dissolve into the air, scattering itself into the evening like pollen of memory. When it vanished, the ruins returned to shadow, but the silence that remained was warm, not empty. The pilgrims left one by one. None spoke of visions. None needed to. The world itself seemed changed, quieter, softer, more aware of its own reflection. The girl turned back once before leaving and whispered, "Thank you." The air shimmered faintly, as if answering her in kind. That night, over the city, the clouds parted. The moon shone directly upon the convent's ruins, and for a brief moment the light that had formed the cross spread outward, washing over Toledo like a benediction. It touched the river, the towers, the glass windows of modern buildings. Every surface became a mirror, and in each reflection, for those who dared to look, stood a woman's face serene, unbroken, infinite. Perhaps it was Beatrice, perhaps it was the mirror itself. It does not matter. What mattered was the light, the testimony of remembrance, the final refusal of forgetting. The world turned, the night deepened, but that glow remained in the air, unseen yet indelible, the soft pulse of an old vow still breathing beneath the centuries. Nos recordamus per speculum. We remember through the mirror, and far beneath the stones, where dust and silver have long since become one, the fragments still hum their quiet truth. Empires fear mirrors, because even in ruin, reflection becomes resurrection.